Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck tech number 130, and it's titled Extreme Sports. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So our random card this week was suggested to us on Reddit over by Jane Fenn, and the random card is going to be Wave of Indifference. And Jane Fenn was very open and honest about the fact that they chose this simply for the flavor text, which is pretty good. But in terms of what it actually does in a game, Wave of Indifference is X and a red for a sorcery that says X target creatures can't block this turn. Now, since Wave of Indifference is going to be caring about X creatures and targeting X creatures, I really could only think of one commander that fit the theme for what this card wanted to do. And so the card that we're going to be running in our command zone this week is Hinata Dawncrowned. And I'm going to be perfectly honest up front. Hinata is not the kind of card that I would typically put in the command zone. This is not the kind of playstyle that I am all about. But if we're also being honest, it is absolutely perfect for Wave of Indifference. So we are going to be playing Hinata Dawncrowned, which is 1 blue, red, white for a 4/4 Kieran Spirit, has flying and trample. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each target, and spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast for each target. So you can kind of see where this is going. If we cast Wave of Indifference with Hinata in play, and we can target every single one of our opponent's creatures for only a single red mana, because if we target 10 creatures, it's going to cost 10 less to cast, meaning that it is 11 total mana, reduced by 10 to only 1 red mana. So this is going to be incredibly powerful, because there's really not any spells in Magic that for a single mana you can prevent all of your opponent's creatures from blocking. So you can kind of see what's going on there. But of course, let's talk a little bit about some of our themes, and I'll explain how this ties into some of our other cards as well. So Wave of Indifference is an X spell, which means that Hinata works well with Wave of Indifference, so presumably Hinata works well with other X spells as well. So our first theme is, of course, X spells, and that specifically ties down to cards that have X in the mana cost and then hopefully 1 or maybe 2 colored mana. We can very rarely reduce a card to 0, but we can definitely reduce it to at least 1 or 2. And if we're casting big splashy spells for only 1 or 2 mana, we can really change the tide of the game. So a good example of that is Gridlock, which is X and a blue for an instant that simply says tap X target non-land permanents. The way that Hinata works with Gridlock means that for 1 blue mana, we can tap every single non-land permanent that our opponents control at instant speed. And that is an insanely powerful effect, because in the same way that Wave of Indifference is going to prevent our opponents from blocking, this is going to shut down our opponent's mana rocks. This is going to prevent our opponent's creatures from blocking because they're going to be tapped. It also could shut down any combo synergies that might be happening. Maybe someone has a tap effect that they need to kind of keep going off, and we can just prevent that from happening right away. So Gridlock is incredibly powerful. And unfortunately, this is going to be one of those decks that doesn't work super well without its commander, so it is important to state that up front. Gridlock is not great when you're actually spending 10 mana to cast it and still probably not tapping everything down in play, but it is very powerful in this deck, so I do want to highlight that that is one of the major things we're trying to do. The next theme that we're looking at is just big spells. And these are big spells that we can actually reduce the cost of, because even though they're not X cost, most of them will say choose any number of targets, or say choose a certain number of targets, enough so that we can actually reduce the cost of it down to 1 or 2 mana. So a great example of that is Chaotic Transformation, which is 5 and a red for a sorcery that says exile up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, up to 1 target planeswalker, and or up to 1 target land. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it, puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles. So this is a kind of weird Chaos Warp effect, where we can get rid of the things that are really messing with us at any given time, and then give our opponents something else Hopefully it's something worse, but there is a chance we hit something better. But if you notice, there are 5 different permanent types that this actually names. Chaotic Transformation hits creatures, enchantments, lands, planeswalkers, and artifacts. That is 5 targets, meaning Chaotic Transformation with Hinata in play is only a single red mana, provided we have at least a target for every single mode. And even if we don't, maybe we're missing Planeswalker or maybe we're missing Enchantment, that still can drop it down to 2-3 mana, which is a lot more manageable than 6. So we're not looking to completely cast stuff for free, but we're looking to cast stuff for a very, very cheap cost, whether it's got X in its mana cost or it's just a big spell in general. And then finally, that's going to lead us to our last theme, which is going to be surviving. We need to have a way to put creatures into play while at the same time still focusing heavily on our spells. And a great way to do that is with cards like Monastery Mentor, which is 2 and a white for a 2/2 human monk with prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. By being able to make tokens whenever we're casting instants or sorceries, we're able to really go off and kind of flood the board with tokens in a way that our opponents might not expect, especially because, again, we're casting our spells for 1 to 2 mana, meaning we can cast a lot of them very, very quickly. And a good portion of them are instants, so we can do that at instant speed, make tokens, untap, and then hit our opponents with our tokens. That's not going to necessarily win us the game outright because they do tend to be pretty small, little 1/1s, maybe 2/2s. Luckily with Monastery Mentor, they do have prowess, so they will get bigger as we cast our spells, but that's only temporary. So it is important that we kind of get a huge mass of these creatures, so that way we can slowly start to roll over our opponents, especially if we're using things like Gridlock to prevent them from blocking, Wave of Indifference to prevent them from blocking, or just Chaotic Transformation to remove their things and replace them with worse things. So overall, those are our themes for the deck, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that synergize very well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions, but sometimes they're just value engines that kind of help push us toward a victory. So the first key card that we're going to talk about is Ovika Enigma Goliath, which is a massive 5 blue-red for a 6/6 legendary creature Phyrexian Nightmare, flying, ward 3, and pay 3 life. And most importantly, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until the end of turn. There's a couple of very key phrases on here with Ovika that we want to be paying attention to. The first is when we cast a non-creature spell, so that's all of our X spells, that's all of our giant spells that are instants and sorceries, we get to make X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblins, where X is the mana value of that spell. Mana value is determined by how much mana is spent to cast it while it's on the stack. So in our hand, an X blue spell like Gridlock is only 1 mana, but while it's on the stack, the mana value is equal to the mana we pumped into it. So if we spent 20 mana on Gridlock, we get to make 21/1 Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. That can be very, very powerful when all of a sudden we tap our opponent's boards and drop 20 hasty goblins. There's not going to be much that our opponents can do to stop that. So Ovika really closes out games, especially because those goblins don't go away at the end of turn. We get to keep them as long as we keep casting spells. We can keep growing our board almost exponentially in power and just slowly run our opponents out. Well, I say slowly, but with Ovika, there's a good chance it won't be slow. It'll probably be just a couple of turns. So Ovika is one of the best finishers in the deck because, again, there's not much our opponents can do against 20 goblins every single turn. Now, moving on though, we have our next key card, which is going to be Reality Spasm. So this is very similar to Gridlock in the sense that it is X, and in this case blue-blue, so an extra blue mana, for an instant that says choose one. Tap X target permanents or untap X target permanents. So in a way, we can use Reality Spasm with Hinata for 2 blue mana at instant speed to tap every single one of our opponent's permanents and it's very notable that this does not say non-land permanents, and untap all of our permanents, again, not non-land permanents. Being able to completely tap our opponents out is absolutely brutal in this deck. And again, it's 2 blue mana at instant speed. And there's so many permanents on board that if we have something like Ovika in play when we cast this, we're talking about generating a lethal amount of goblins. Because each player maybe, say, has 10 lands in play, maybe they've got 5 creatures. That's like 45 goblins right there just from our opponents, not including our own things. So all of a sudden, Reality Spasm is going to go absolutely crazy. Now, it is also worth mentioning that we cannot choose both of the modes. We can't tap our opponent's things and untap our things at the same time. There will be times when you want to do one over the other, so it's important to notice that you can do both, but you cannot do both at the same time. However, Reality Spasm, just like Ovika, is kind of just a finisher in this deck. Being able to completely shut down the rest of the table while giving ourselves a chance to really run away with the game is very, very powerful. And finally, that's going to lead us into our last key card, which is going to be Elementalist's Palette. So again, it's kind of weird that lately I've been putting a decent amount of mana rocks and board wipes into our key cards. I tend not to do that as much as possible because they're just cards that every deck needs. But in this case, I think Elementalist's Palette is a mana rock that really deserves its spot because it is 3 mana for an artifact that says whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost, put 2 charge counters on Elementalist's Palette, then tap, add a mana of any color, and tap, add a colorless for each charge counter on Elementalist's Palette. Spend this mana only on costs that contain X. So if we pump this into Gridlock, for example, we are able to tap down as many things are in play with Hinata, while at the same time being able to tap down extra things with Elementalist Palette or just do additional extra things, because we can put even more into the X. We can essentially double what we're putting into X at any given time. And that doesn't seem super great with cards like Reality Spasm or with Gridlock because we're already tapping everything down. Why would we need to tap more things down? Because that just makes it cheaper with Hinata. But we do have a fair amount of burn spells in the deck that cost X mana to cast, and Elementalist Palette essentially lets us double the damage that we're doing with those burn spells. So Elementalist Palette is phenomenal. And in a way, it's kind of like a backup Hinata. If Hinata ever gets killed, we can just kind of use Elementalist Palette to make our stuff even cheaper, or maybe not cheaper, but at least put the mana into it that we couldn't before with Hinata being gone. So those are all of our key cards, and the next thing we're going to have to do for our deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that either synergize very well together, are kind of a value engine on their own, or in some cases are just cool cards that I want to highlight because I think they're underplayed. So the first cool interaction that I want to talk about is actually one of the only infinite combos in the entire deck. In fact, it might be the only infinite combo in the entire deck, and it is Naru-Meha Master Wizard and Ghostly Flicker. So the way this is going to work is if we have Naru-Meha, which is 2 blue for a 3/3 human wizard, she has Flash. When Naru-Meha Master Wizard enters the battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Other wizards you control get +1/+1. Then, Ghostly Flicker is 2 and a blue for an instant. Exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under your control. If we have another creature in play, we cast Ghostly Flicker, we target that, or I suppose we don't even need a creature, we can target lands, artifacts, whatever. Then we cast Naru-Meha with Ghostly Flicker on the stack. Naru-Meha will copy the Ghostly Flicker. The copy of Ghostly Flicker will then flicker Naru-Meha and something else. The new Naru-Meha comes in, sees that the original Ghostly Flicker is still on the stack, copies it again, which then copies Naru-Meha, and we make infinite flicker effects of Naru-Meha and one other thing. That one other thing can be a land, which we are consistently tapping every single time it comes back into play, generating an infinite amount of mana. It could also be any creatures that are making tokens. It could be anything that's drawing us cards when it enters the battlefield. There are plenty of ways that once we have this interaction, we can just straight up win the game. Plus, it's going to be a great way to, like I said, generate infinite mana and then sink it into our massive X spells, which, as we've already mentioned, there are burn spells among them, letting us just burn out the table for an infinite amount of damage. Now, I know this isn't everybody's favorite way to win a game. Some people really hate infinite combos. That's okay. Like I said, this is the only one in the deck, and I personally think it's important to have at least one into any given deck, because sometimes games just gotta end, and combat can't quite always get there. So this is my personal choice for it, because these two don't outright win the game. You do still need a third piece to somehow close the game, but I think it's worth talking about. Anyway, though, moving on to our next cool interaction, this one is going to be between Smoke Spirit's Aid and Meteor Blast. Smoke Spirit's Aid is X and a red for a sorcery. For each of up to X target creatures, create a red aura enchantment token named Smoke Blessing attached to that creature. Those tokens have Enchant Creature, and when Enchanted Creature dies, it deals 1 damage to its controller and you create a treasure token. We're going to combine that up with Meteor Blast, which is X red 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 for a sorcery. Meteor Blast deals 4 damage to each of X target creatures and or players. You can kind of see where this is going, but Smoke Spirit's Aid is essentially, again with Hinata, a single red mana to put a Smoke Blessing attached to every single creature that our opponents control, meaning that when they die, they do 1 damage to their controller and we make a treasure token. Now, we don't have a ton of direct board wipes in this deck. One of the best ones we have is Meteor Blast, because there's a very good chance that 4 damage is going to kill most creatures in play. There will most likely be some that survive, but at the end of the day, this is going to kind of do what we want no matter what, because just like Smoke Spirit's Aid, Meteor Blast is just 3 red mana to do 4 damage to every single creature and player at the table. Obviously not including us and our creatures. You probably don't want to target your own things with it, but this will remove most creatures in play, and for 4 total red mana, you can remove pretty much everything in play and also do that damage to their controllers' faces, and at the same time make that many treasure tokens. So it's not necessarily a full board wipe, and it's definitely probably, well, most likely, not going to win you the game, but it is going to do enough and get us enough treasures that we can probably start to take control of the game from that point forward. Plus, again, we're doing this damage to our opponent's creatures, not to our own, so we can still be attacking with all of our tokens and Hinata and anything else that we may have in play. So those are our cool interactions, and of course, the last thing we got to do about our deck tech before we see the deck in action is talk about the price. So this week, the total deck price came out to $82.02, and most of that price is coming from Clever Concealment, which is 2 white for an instant, has Convoke. Any number of target non-land permanents you control phase out, and it is $7.02, so if you are looking to trim the price of the deck down to about $75, this would be the card to cut. Now, at the same time, Clever Concealment is one of the best ways to protect our board from board wipes, because it just phases everything out, so it can't get exiled, can't get destroyed, none of that. And it has Convoke, so we could essentially cast it for free. And with Hinata, since we're targeting our things, we only have to pay the 2 white. So as long as we have 2 white creatures in play, one of which could be Hinata, this is 100% free. And that is very, very powerful, because we could be pretty much tapped out or even entirely tapped out, and our opponents might go to wipe our board and we can respond by saving it. Now, this isn't 100% foolproof, obviously there are ways to get around it, but it is worth including in the deck because there's not a ton of ways in the Jeskai colors to prevent damage to the entire board. There's ways to make your team indestructible and things like that, but indestructible doesn't save us from exile, which is becoming a lot more common. So I think Clever Concealment really does earn its place as the most expensive card in the deck. However, if you are looking to trim down the price a little bit, there are some budget inclusions that just give indestructible rather than phasing out that would also be pretty good in most situations, but again, not quite as good as Clever Concealment. Anyway, With that out of the way, we have to take a look at some cards that could probably go into the deck that are a little bit too expensive. Cards that I would love to throw in, but I couldn't quite fit into our budget. And this week, I've only got one of those cards, and that one is Orvar the Allform. So Orvar the Allform is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 legendary creature shapeshifter. It's got Changeling. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, if it targets one or more other permanents you control, create a token that's a copy of one of those permanents. When a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard this card, create a token that's a copy of target permanent. So Orvar really is the payoff for being able to target all of our things, because if we're targeting our creatures, we get to copy them. If we're targeting our lands, we get to copy them. And yeah, we only get to copy one thing at a time, but that's still going to be powerful enough at any given time to either ramp us, put more power in play, or put us in a situation where we have such a tremendous board state that we're making so many tokens and our opponents really can't do anything to stop it. On the other hand, if you're looking to swap it in and you need a card to take out, the card I would recommend is Manaform Hellkite. And the reason I would say this is because Manaform Hellkite on its own is not a bad card, but unfortunately, I misread this card when I put it into the deck, so it doesn't really do what I want it to be doing. So Manaform Hellkite is 2 red for a 4/4 creature dragon, flying. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. So for those that were paying close attention as we read this, it says X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. That is not what I thought this card said when I put it in the deck. I thought it made an XX equal to the mana value of a spell, which is very different, as we talked about earlier. But if it's mana spent to cast it, we typically only want to be casting spells for 1 or 2 mana. So being able to make just a 1/1 dragon or a 2/2 dragon isn't really that great. It would be a lot better if we could make 6/6s or 10/10s, but that's not what we can do with Manaform and Hinata. And while, yeah, chipping in for 1 or 2 every single turn is still pretty good, it's nowhere near as good as I thought it was when I first put it into the deck. So if you do get the chance to swap it, I would recommend Orvar over the Hellkite, because it's the same mana value. It's a little bit weaker, it's a 3/3 instead of a 4/4, but it's going to let you make permanent token copies of all of your permanents if you're targeting them, which is exactly what the deck wants to be doing anyway. So that is my recommendation for the budget section of this deck, but the next thing we got to do is, of course, see how this deck performs in a game. However, before we actually get to that point, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you could help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. We are very slowly making our climb to 1,000 subscribers. I would love to get there before the end of the year. So if you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing, and of course, send the video to your friends if you think that they would like it as well. But if you're interested in reaching out to us, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, and you can send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. These are all great ways to reach out if you ever have any questions, you just want to chat. I try to be as responsible as I can with my, responding, but I tend to be a little bit slow sometimes, so if I don't respond right away, I do apologize. I will get to it eventually. But if you have any suggestions for cards that you would like to see turned into videos, you can send them to me on any of those platforms. You can also just put them in the comments of this video or any other video, and I will do my best to get to them at some point. Now, unfortunately, because I do have a ton of suggestions that come in, I can't promise to get to all of them at any given time, unless, of course, you decide that you want to support us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, or here on YouTube as a channel member. If you join us on either of those 2 platforms, you get the guarantee from me that I will turn any card you suggest into a video for the channel at some point. If I'm being perfectly honest, it may take me a while because, again, as I said, I get plenty of suggestions and I love seeing all of them come in. I love being able to brew decks around them, but I can't guarantee that they will be turned into decks for anyone but our patrons and channel members. Of course, that's not the only thing that they get. They also get a random card sent to them every month. They get to join a Discord where we put together a lot of these decks and also where we record a lot of the games. So if you've ever wanted to be in a game on this channel, that is a great way to do it. And they also get access to the deck list an entire week early. So they get plenty of cool things, and I'm very appreciative that they get access to the deck list a week early because they have caught quite a few mistakes that I've made in the past. So, of course, we got to give that shout out to our current patrons and channel members of William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Devin Purser, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Patty Whack. To the 10, I believe, if I can count correctly, of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And I suppose I've rambled on enough about ways you can support the channel, so let's see how our deck performs in a game. And this week, we're going to be joined by 3 opponents playing some very sweet decks of their own. And in this case, we are being joined by Luke, who is playing Feldegriff, Doodle, who is playing Ziralin, and Cow, who is playing Rasad in Bashir and Sword Coast Sailor. So starting off with Luke's deck, Feldegriff, this is kind of a group hug deck, but only really group hug in the sense that he wants to give his opponents as many hippo tokens as possible and then watch them beat each other up while he kind of walls himself off from the rest of the table. So I think out of all of our opponents, this is probably the one that I'm the most concerned about. I've played Feldegriff before. I know how powerful this deck can be. If you're actually interested in a more token combat centered version of Feldegriff, check out the video that we did on the channel. I will make sure that there's a tag for that in the video. And then, of course, since he's making so many tokens for his opponents and walling himself off, if we can't get to him with our X spells or if we can't get to him with our tokens and our creatures, there's not much we're going to be able to do to take down Feldegriff. So I do think that's why he's our most dangerous opponent this week. Moving into our next opponent, we have Doodle playing Ziralin of the Claw. This is a dragon type deck. He wants to make sure that he is putting as many dragons in play as possible and using certain shenanigans to kind of prevent himself from exiling them with Ziralin. Since Ziralin exiles at the end of turn, if he can find ways to blink them or find a way to maybe sacrifice them and then bring them back into play from the graveyard, that is really what he wants to be doing. So I am a little concerned about this deck. I've played against it a couple of times up to this point, and I know how explosive it can be with Ziralin in play, but overall, I'm kind of just interested to see what we can do against it. I'm not sure how well our X spells are going to fare against dragons, but I am very curious to see. And then finally, we have Cow playing Rasad and Sword Coast Sailor. This is a toughness matters deck. So because Rasad allows his creatures to do damage equal to toughness rather than power, he wants to play as many things that make big toughness as possible, including Rasad himself, which is an 0/3, and then use Sword Coast Sailor to essentially make Rasad unblockable as long as he's attacking his opponent with the highest life total. This is another deck that I've played against quite a few times, and honestly, every time I see it, Rasad just gets more and more dangerous. It's not surprising to see Rasad, become a 9/9 that immediately doubles his power and toughness, or I guess technically gets double strike. I'm not exactly sure, but in other words, maybe both. He's able to just kind of knock people out of the game very, very quickly. So you don't expect the Azorius deck to really be the aggressive strategy at the table, but this is probably the most aggressive deck at the table, including us being a token deck and Ziralin being a dragon deck. So very, very cool stuff from Cow, as always. But overall, let me know what you think in the comments. Are any of these opponents probably the most dangerous for us to face? And of course, once the game is over, let me know which deck you thought was super cool. If there's any decks you want to see more about, I will of course try to get the deck lists if people are interested. But let's see how our X spells can perform against all of these opponents, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Luke goes first, followed by Doodle, myself, and then AngryCow. On Luke's first turn, he plays a Selesnya Guildgate. Doodle plays a Spine Rock Knoll, hiding away a card. I play a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Cow plays a Plains. Luke plays an Island. Doodle plays an Endless Sands. I play a Battlefield Forge. Cow plays an Island and casts Mind Stone. Unfortunately, on Luke's turn, he misses his third land drop and passes. Doodle plays a mountain. I play an exotic orchard. Cow unfortunately also misses his third land drop, so he casts his commander Rasad in Bashir, letting his creatures do damage equal to their toughness rather than their power, and doubling an attacking creature's toughness if he attacks while also having the initiative. Luke casts a Wayfarer's Bauble, but still doesn't hit his land drop. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Leyline Tyrant, no longer losing red mana as steps and phases end, also being able to pay any amount of red mana when it dies to do that much damage to any target. I play a mountain and cast my commander Hinata Dawncrowned, making all my spells cost 1 less for each target and making my opponent's spells cost 1 more for each target. Cow plays an island and attacks Luke for 3 with Rasad, then, in his second main phase, casts Weathered Sentinels, which has Defender but can attack players that attacked Cow on their last turn as though it didn't have Defender, also getting +3/+3 and indestructible when it attacks. Then he also casts Slagworm Armor and passes. Luke plays a forest and casts Harrow, sacrificing his island to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play. He then uses those 2 lands to sacrifice the Wayfarer's Bauble, searching his library for another basic land, putting it into play tapped, and officially catching up to the rest of the table in land count. Doodle plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size. On my turn, I cast Soulfire Eruption for only 3 mana since I can choose 6 targets, exiling the top card of my library for each target, doing damage to that target equal to the mana value of the exiled card, then being able to play the exiled cards until the end of my next turn. In response, Doodle activates Endless Sands to exile his Leyline Tyrant, then my spell resolves, exiling Azorius Signet for Leyline Tyrant, but it's no longer in play, so it takes no damage, a Mountain for Rasad, doing no damage, Cultural Exchange for Weathered Sentinels, doing 6 damage to it, killing it, Change of Plans for Luke, doing 2 damage, a Mountain for Doodle, doing no damage, and a Temple of Enlightenment for Cow, doing no damage. Once that's resolved, I play a Mountain from Exile and also cast the Azorius Signet from Exile before moving to combat and attacking Cow for 4 with Hinata. On Cow's turn, he casts his commander's background, Sword Coast Sailor, giving Rasad unblockable if he attacks the opponent with the highest life total. Then he attacks me for 3 with Rasad. Luke casts Circuitous Route, searching his library for 2 basic lands and/or gates, putting them into play tapped. Doodle casts a Worn Power Stone. I cast a Murmuring Mystic, letting me make a 1/1 bird token whenever I cast an instant or sorcery spell. Then I attack Doodle for 4 with Hinata, and in my second main phase, I cast Change of Plans from Exile, targeting Hinata and Murmuring Mystic, so it costs 2 less, letting both of them connive, putting a +1/+1 counter on Hinata, then phasing them both out while also making a bird token. Then I play a Temple of Enlightenment from Exile, scrying 1, and pass. Cow plays an island and equips Rasad with the Slagworm Armor, giving him +0/+6. He attacks me for 9 with Rasad, then at the end of turn, since an opponent lost 7 or more life this turn, Doodle activates Spine Rock Knoll, casting Knoll Spine Dragon for free, but Cow has an answer, countering it with Wash Away. On Luke's turn, he casts his commander Feldegriff, immediately activating it 3 times to give itself Trample and give Doodle 3 1/1 Hippo tokens. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a mountain, then casts his commander Zirlin of the Claw, which can be activated to search his library for a dragon, put it into play with haste, and then exile it in the next end step. When I untap, my creatures phase back in, then I play an island and cast Mana Form Hellkite, which, whenever I cast a non-creature spell, makes a dragon token with haste equal to the mana spent to cast it that is also sacrificed in the next end step. I then move to combat and attack Cow for 5 with Hinata and Doodle for 1 with a bird. On Cow's turn, he casts Aarakocra Sneak, taking the initiative, going to the secret entrance in the Undercity and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. He then plays a Plains and moves to combat, attacking Doodle with an unblockable Rasad, doubling his toughness since he has the initiative, hitting him for 18 total commander damage. Luke plays a Forest and casts Ghostly Prison, making his opponents pay 2 mana to attack him. Doodle plays a Mountain and activates Zirlin, searching his library for a dragon, in this case Blast Furnace Hellkite, putting it into play and giving all creatures that attack his opponents double strike. He also blitzes in Jaxus the Troublemaker and activates Jaxus, discarding a card to make a token copy of the Blast Furnace Hellkite. But unfortunately, Cow has a response, channeling Touch the Spirit Realm to exile the Hellkite until the end of turn. This prevents Doodle from making a token copy, but does allow him to permanently keep the Hellkite when it returns. He still goes to combat though, attacking Cow with 2 hippos. Cow blocks 1 with the Sneak, killing it, taking 1 damage, then Doodle takes the initiative, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. Then at the end of turn, he sacrifices Jaxus, drawing a card, and his Blast Furnace Hellkite returns to play. Still at the end of turn, I cast Aurelia's Fury, targeting 8 creatures and each of my opponents, so it costs 11 less to cast, doing 1 damage to each target, wiping away the hippo tokens, tapping all creatures dealt damage this way, making me a bird token and a 2/2 dragon. Then on my turn, I play a Plains and attack Luke with Hinata for 10, paying 2 mana for Ghostly Prison, attack Doodle for 1 with a bird, taking the initiative and searching my library for a basic land, putting it into my hand, and I also attack Cow with everything else for 16 damage. Before blocks, Luke activates his commander, giving it flying and giving Cow a hippo token, which he uses to block my Murmuring Mystic, killing the token but only taking 14 damage. On Cow's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking me for 18 with an unblockable double-striking Rasad, presenting lethal commander damage. Before the damage, I cast Disorder in the Court, targeting all 5 of my opponent's creatures, so it costs 5 less mana to cast, exiling them all, returning them to play in the next end step, and investigating 5 times, making a bird and saving me from dying to Rasad. In his second main phase, Cow cast Oblivion Ring, exiling Hinata, but in response I cast Prismatic Boon, which costs 7 mana less to cast since I can target all 7 of my creatures, giving them protection from white. In the end step, all of my opponent's creatures come back into play tapped, letting Cow retake the initiative, going into the Forge and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Rasad. Still in the end step, Luke activates Feldegriff to give Doodle 3 more hippo tokens. On Luke's turn, he plays an island and casts Theft of Dreams, drawing a card for each tapped creature target opponent controls, drawing 5 cards by targeting me. He also casts Grow from the Ashes, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play. After that, he casts Temple Bell, which can be activated to let each player draw a card. In Doodle's upkeep, Luke activates the Temple Bell, letting each player draw a card. Then, Doodle plays a Mountain and activates Zirlin, searching his library for a dragon, in this case Bogardan Hellkite, putting it into play, doing 5 damage divided as he chooses when it enters, doing 1 to each of my 2 untapped birds, killing them and doing 3 to Cow. Once that's resolved, he also casts Tyrant Familiar, which, since he controls his commander, gets +2/+2 and does 7 damage to target creature when it attacks. He attacks me with all of his creatures except the Blast Furnace Hellkite and a hippo, for a total of 28 damage, doing 7 damage to Hinata, attempting to kill my commander. In response, I sacrifice a clue, drawing a card, and after that I cast Ghostly Flicker, exiling Hinata and the Manaform Hellkite, returning them to play, saving my commander, making a bird token and a 1/1 dragon. This lets me block Doodle's Tyrant with the bird and the hippos with Hinata and the Manaform, killing all the tokens while I take 10. Then at the end of turn, Doodle exiles his Bogardan Hellkite. On my turn, I play an island and sacrifice 2 clues to draw 2 cards. Then I cast Smoke Spirit's Aid, which costs 7 less since it's targeting 7 creatures, putting a Smoke Blessing aura on all of my opponent's creatures, making it so that whenever they die, they do 1 damage to their controller and I create a treasure token. Then I also make a bird and a 1/1 dragon, but before I move to combat, Cow casts Ephemerate, exiling his Aarakocra Sneak and returning it to play, taking the initiative, going into the arena and goading Hinata. Since Hinata has to attack, I attack Luke with her for 8, paying 2 mana, and also attack Cow for 10 with my 2 dragons. Cow blocks the mana form with his Sneak, but before damage, he casts Scars of the Veteran for free, exiling Momentary Blink from his hand, preventing the next 7 damage that would be done to it and putting 7 +0/+1 counters on it in the next end step. This means Luke still takes 8, while Cow only takes 2, kills my mana form, and I take the initiative, going into the Lost Well and scrying 2. Then in my second main phase, I cast Twin Flame, copying one of my bird tokens, but before that resolves, I cast Sudden Substitution, trading control of the Twin Flame with Cow's Rasad, so now I control Rasad while Cow gets to choose new targets for the Twin Flame, making a copy of his Sneak, which is exiled in the end step, retaking the initiative, drawing a card by going to the archives. However, since I cast 2 spells, I do get to make 2 birds and 2 dragons that will be sacrificed at the end of turn. In Cow's upkeep, Ephemerate rebounds, letting him exile his Sneak and return it to play, again taking the initiative, going to the Throne of the Dead 3, revealing the top 10 cards of his library, putting an Angel of Destiny into play from among them with 3 +1/+1 counters. Then he takes the initiative again, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. After that, he plays a Plains and casts Dusk, destroying all creatures power 3 or greater, triggering several smoke auras, so Luke takes 1, Doodle takes 3, and I make 4 treasures. On Luke's turn, he plays an Island Sanctuary, then letting him skip his draw step, and if he does, preventing creatures without flying or Island Walk from attacking him until his next turn. He then plays a Bant Panorama and passes. Doodle plays a mountain and casts Ganax Astral Hunter, making a treasure token whenever it or another dragon enters under his control. He then recasts his commander Zirulin, and at the end of Doodle's turn, I sacrifice all of my treasures to also sacrifice the last of my clues, drawing 2 cards. On my turn, I play an island and recast my commander Hinata, but unfortunately Luke has a response, countering her with Rewind and untapping 4 of his lands. He then attacks Cow for 5 with Murmuring Mystic and Luke for 5 with an unblockable Rasad, since Sword Coast Sailor is still active, paying 2 to do so. Before blocks, Luke casts Domineering Will to give Cow control of all of Doodle's creatures until the end of turn. He also activates Temple Bell to let everyone draw a card. Then Cow is able to block my Murmuring Mystic with Ganax, the Sneak, and a Hippo, killing everything but Ganax, while Luke still takes 5 damage from Rasad. In Cow's upkeep, he takes the initiative, scrying 2, then plays an island and casts Zatalpa Primal Dawn. On Luke's turn, he skips drawing a card so he can only be attacked by creatures with flying or island walk. Then he plays a Plains and recasts his commander Feldegriff, immediately activating the ability 3 times to give Doodle 3 Hippo tokens. On Doodle's turn, he activates Zirulin, searching his library for a dragon, in this case Lathlis the Dragon Queen, putting it into play and letting him make a 5/5 dragon token whenever another dragon enters under his control, triggering Ganax, making a treasure token. He then casts Conjurer's Closet, letting him exile one of his creatures in the end step and return it to play under his control. He moves to combat and attacks Cow for 14 with all of his creatures, but Cow blocks Lathlis with Zatalpa, killing the dragon, and although Doodle activates her ability twice to give all dragons he controls +2/+0, he's still only able to hit Cow for 10, putting him to only 1 life, while Doodle takes the initiative and scries 2. At the end of turn, Conjurer's Closet exiles Ganax, returning him to play, letting Doodle make another treasure token. On my turn, I play an island and recast my commander Hinata. I then attack Cow for 2 with 2 bird tokens and attack Doodle for 5 with an unblockable Rasad. Before damage, Luke activates Feldegriff to give it flying and gains Cow 2 life, letting him block one of my birds, take 1 damage, and stay in the game with 2 life. Doodle, however, can't stop Rasad, so he takes a lethal amount of commander damage, getting knocked out of the game. I also take the initiative, goading Zatalpa. Then, in my second main phase, I cast Descent of the Dragons, targeting 3 creatures so it costs 3 less to cast, destroying all of my bird tokens and replacing them with 4/4 dragon tokens. In Cow's upkeep, Luke activates Temple Bell, letting each player draw a card. Then Cow casts Midnight Pathlighter, making it so that only legendary creatures can block his creatures, and also letting him venture into the dungeon whenever one of his creatures deals combat damage to a player. He then plays a Forbidding Watchtower and casts a Shield Mage Advocate. Since Cow tapped all of his mana and can't pay for Ghostly Prison, he's now able to attack me with Zatalpa, so to prevent that, I cast Icy Blast for 4 mana, since it targets 4 creatures, tapping them and preventing them from untapping in their controller's next untap step, since I control a creature with power 4 or greater. At the end of turn, Luke activates Feldegriff twice, giving Cow 2 hippos. On Luke's turn, he skips his draw step to prevent any creature from attacking him unless they have Island Walker flying, plays a Crocent Verge, then passes. In my upkeep, I take the initiative, drawing a card, then attack Cow with all of my dragons for 12 damage and attack Luke for 4 with Hinata, paying 2 for Ghostly Prison. Before damage though, Luke casts Blunt the Assault, gaining a life for each creature on the battlefield, which is a total of 11, and prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Before that resolves though, he activates Feldegriff 5 times, giving 5 more hippos to Cow so that he gains 16 total life. Then, in my second main phase, I play a Path of Ancestry and pass. In Cow's upkeep, Luke activates Temple Bell, letting each player draw a card. Cow then plays an island and casts the Reality Chip. He moves to combat, attacking me with 7 hippos, and before blocks, Luke casts Flurry of Wings, making 7 1/1 bird tokens since there are 7 attacking creatures. Then I block one of the hippos with Rasad, killing the token and taking the other 6 damage, and Cow takes the initiative, making a treasure token, and then in his second main phase, cast Dawn, returning all creatures with power 2 or less from his graveyard to his hand, and finally recast the Aarakocra Sneak that he just put to his hand, taking the initiative and making a 4/1 skeleton token. On Luke's turn, he activates Temple Bell in his upkeep, drawing everyone a card, then cast Reigns of Power, untapping all of his creatures, untapping all of Cow's creatures, and then swapping control of each creature they both control, giving them haste until the end of turn. Before they can move to combat though, I cast Reality Spasm, which costs 21 mana less since it has 21 targets, tapping down all of my opponent's creatures and their lands. This allows me on my turn to attack Cow for 17 damage with my dragons and Rasad, knocking him out of the game, and also attack Luke for 4 with Hinata, paying for Ghostly Prison, to knock him out with lethal commander damage, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Our deck definitely performed very, very well. I think that it really played a lot more like a control deck than I expected in the very beginning. I knew we'd have some controlling aspects to it, but I didn't expect us to become the archenemy very early on in the game and then really just kind of manage it and survive all the way to the end, even winning the game. So a very, very good showing by Hinata, and I was very impressed by Hinata. Like I said earlier when we talked about this, Hinata is not a commander I would normally pick up and play. It's just not my play style. It's not really what I enjoy doing at a table. But holy cow, it was incredibly powerful to see it go off. Being able to cast giant X spells for just 1 or 2 mana felt really good, I'm not going to lie. So very impressive, and I think there's some tweaks that could be made to it. But let me know in the comments if there's cards you think that should be added or taken out. I would love to see what people do. I know Hinata is a very popular commander, so I'd love to see what people have done with it. Otherwise, though, talking about the other decks at the table, I think that Cow's deck also performed very well. Rasad was very impressive and actually responsible for a commander damage kill, which is not something that shows up very often at this table. Well, I should also mention Hinata got one too, which was very unexpected. I don't think Hinata can normally do that, but very cool to see. But Rasad being able to have the Slagworm armor on him, swinging for 9 damage, doubling his own toughness to 18, and just kind of smacking the table around was very, very impressive. And Sword Coast Sailor really has shot up a lot in value, in my own opinion, because it really puts the rest of the table under a lot of pressure. There were a couple of turns where I was forced to attack with Hinata, and because I didn't want to lose Hinata, I swung into Luke, who had a higher life total than me, putting him to a lower life total than me, and then putting myself at risk of dying to Rasad. So it was very cool to see kind of the mental games that were being played at the table because of Sword Coast Sailor. So a very impressive deck. I would love to see it again. It's always a ton of fun to play against, even though there's a lot of fear going around that Rasad could kill you at any given tome. Next up, though, we have Luke, who over there with Feldergriff was putting in a lot of work in the late game, which was very impressive considering he missed his third land for 2 turns in a row at the very beginning. But you really wouldn't have known it by the end of the game. He caught up very quickly. Very impressive use of his ramp spells to get back into the game. And I think the ability to give his opponents a ton of hippos really played a lot into the outcome of the game. I don't think things would have ended quite the same if he weren't just giving out hippos all over the place. So very, very cool showing by Feldergriff. Also a deck that I hope we see again in the future. And then finally, of course, Doodle and his Zirlin deck didn't quite make it to the end, unfortunately. He got stuck a couple of times on, well, also what he was doing. He couldn't quite keep a lot of dragons in play. He couldn't find ways to flicker them. He kept losing them when he tutored them up with Zirlin. So not quite what he wanted to be doing, but it was still very impressive that he was able to do so much damage kind of out of nowhere, bringing in the Bogarden Hellkite, bringing in Lathless, and just kind of swinging for the fences and doing what he could to close out the game. Not quite getting there, but I think that if a couple of other things had gone in his direction, I think he probably easily could have walked away with that game. So a very cool showing by everyone in play, and honestly, this was the kind of game that I love to play, just seeing very unique commanders and very unique play styles, and just having some good time with some good people. So let me know what you all think. Let me know, like I said earlier, if there are any cards that you have suggestions for that you would like to see turned into decks. I would be happy to work on those. But otherwise, hope you had a good time. Hope you enjoyed the deck tech and the gameplay. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.